March 3, 1943, the Bismarck Sea. A Japanese destroyer captain watched in horror as the American bomber dove toward his ship at masthead height, flying so low the spray from the waves almost touched its belly. He'd seen B-25 Mitchells before. They dropped bombs from altitude, easy to evade. But this one wasn't pulling up. And then he saw it. The entire nose of the aircraft erupted in flame. Not bombs. Guns. More guns than any medium bomber had a right to carry. 14 50 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously, pouring 6,000 rounds per minute into the destroyer's superstructure. The concentrated stream of lead-shredded steel plating ignited ammunition stores and killed everyone on the exposed deck in seconds. Before the Japanese crew could react, the bomber had already passed overhead, banking hard to line up its next victim. Behind it, 8 more B-25s dove in at wave-top altitude, each one a flying gun platform bristling with forward-firing weapons that had been scavenged, improvised, and installed by hand in Australian workshops. In less than 3 minutes, the Japanese convoy, 8 transport ships carrying 6,900 troops desperately needed in New Guinea, began its death spiral. Oil slicks spread across the turquoise water. Men leaped from burning decks. The Imperial Japanese Navy had just discovered what happens when you face an enemy who's rewritten the rules of air combat. The man who created these flying monsters wasn't a general or an engineer from some American aircraft factory. He was a 43-year-old maintenance officer who'd stolen the guns from wrecked fighters, welded them into bomber noses in makeshift workshops, and taught pilots how to use them. His name was Pappy Gunn. And he had a very personal reason for wanting to end this war as quickly and violently as possible. Somewhere in Manila, behind Japanese barbed wire at Santo Tomas internment camp, his wife and 4 children were starving. Every ship he sank brought him one day closer to freeing them. This is the story of how one man's desperation to save his family changed the Pacific War forever. Paul Irvin Gunn was born on October 18, 1899, in Quitman, Arkansas, the son of a blacksmith. Like many boys of his generation, young Paul became fascinated with aviation after reading about the fighter aces of World War I battling over the trenches of France. Unlike most, he actually did something about it. In the waning days of the Great War, just weeks before the armistice, the 18-year-old Gunn enlisted in the United States Navy. The Navy wouldn't make him a pilot, not with his limited education and lack of formal qualifications. Instead, he became an aviation machinist's mate, learning to tear down and rebuild aircraft engines at Naval Air Station Pensacola in Florida. But Gunn wasn't content to just fix aircraft. On his own time, using his own money, he took flying lessons. He saved every penny of his meager Navy pay and eventually bought a surplus seaplane, teaching himself to fly through trial and error over the waters of Pensacola Bay. When his first enlistment ended, Gunn learned that the Navy had begun a revolutionary program allowing enlisted men to become pilots without requiring them to be commissioned officers. He had married Clara Louise Polly Crosby in June 1921, and when he re-enlisted in 1923, he was selected to become one of the Navy's first enlisted naval aviators. For the next 16 years, Gunn served with distinction, flying fighters with the legendary Top Hat Squadron, VF-1B, one of the Navy's oldest fighter units. He became a flight instructor at Pensacola. Their family eventually grew to include 2 sons, Paul and Nathan, and 2 daughters, Connie and Julie. By 1939, after 21 years of service, Chief Petty Officer Gunn retired from the Navy with a pilot's wings, a mechanic's knowledge, and an engineer's intuition for what made aircraft work. He moved his family to Hawaii, where he started a charter flying service. When the venture struggled, Gunn accepted an offer in 1940 to move to the Philippines. A wealthy Filipino-Spanish businessman named Andres Soriano was building a new airline, and he needed someone with Gunn's unique combination of flying and mechanical skills. Philippine Airlines started operations on March 15, 1941, with a fleet of 4 red Beechcraft Model 18 twin-engine aircraft. Gunn became the airline's chief pilot and operations manager, flying passengers and cargo between Manila and provincial cities, scouting routes, and maintaining the small fleet. The Gunns settled into a comfortable life in Manila. The children attended American schools. Polly made friends with other Navy and Army wives. The future looked bright. Then, on December 7, 1941, everything changed. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor happened on a Sunday morning in Hawaii, but due to the international dateline, it was already December 8 in the Philippines. Within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese aircraft appeared over Clark Field in Pampanga, the main U.S. Army Air Force's base in the Philippines. They caught most of the American aircraft on the ground, destroying them where they sat. The Philippines were clearly next on Japan's invasion list. Gunn knew immediately what this meant. The crippling of the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor meant the Philippines couldn't be reinforced or defended. The Japanese would invade, and when they did, his family would be trapped. The U.S. Army Air Forces commissioned him as a captain and put his airline's Beechcraft to work, evacuating personnel and flying supplies to besieged American and Filipino forces. For the next 2 weeks, Gunn flew mission after mission in increasingly desperate circumstances. He evacuated President Manuel Quezon of the Philippines to Mindanao. He flew supplies into Clark Field, even as Japanese aircraft strafed the runway. He made trips to Bataan, delivering medical supplies under fire. For one particularly daring mission, flying an unarmored civilian aircraft into hostile territory to deliver desperately needed medical supplies to the troops on Bataan, he would later be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. But even as Gunn performed these heroic missions, he knew time was running out. His plan had been simple. When things got really bad, he would load Polly and the kids into one of the Beechcraft and fly them to safety in Australia. What he hadn't counted on was how quickly the situation would deteriorate. On Christmas Eve 1941, Gunn received orders that would haunt him for the next 3 years. Colonel Harold George needed him to fly a load of Army Air Forces personnel to Australia immediately. It was a one-way trip. The aircraft wouldn't have enough fuel to return. Gunn drew out all his military pay, borrowed every dollar he could, and gave the money to Polly. His instructions were stark. If the Japanese captured her, she was to tell them he'd been killed in a plane crash weeks ago. Maybe that would protect her and the children. He took off on Christmas Eve with a plane full of military personnel, flying south through a gauntlet of Japanese fighters and then across thousands of miles of ocean. When he landed in Australia, he expected orders to return and evacuate his family. Instead, he was told to remain in Australia. The Philippines were falling, and there would be no rescue flights. Gunn learned the truth in stages. Manila had fallen in early January. American civilians had been rounded up. His family had been interned at Santo Tomas University, converted into a prison camp. Polly and the girls were in one building, his teenage sons in another. They were allowed to see each other only briefly in food lines. They were alive, but beyond his reach, trapped behind enemy lines with no hope of immediate rescue. For most men, this would have been the end of the story, a family tragedy to be endured until the war's end. But Gunn had skills, connections, and a burning need to do something that would help win this war and bring him back to his family. What he needed was an opportunity. That opportunity came in the form of an innovative Air Force general named George Kenny and a desperate need to find a better way to sink Japanese ships. By mid-1942, the Allied situation in the Southwest Pacific had stabilized somewhat, but remained precarious. American and Australian forces held Port Moresby on the southern coast of New Guinea, but the Japanese controlled most of the island's northern coast, with major bases at Lae, Salamaua, and other locations. The Japanese were determined to push south and capture Port Moresby to use as a springboard for an invasion of Australia itself. The problem was straightforward. The Japanese needed to reinforce and resupply their bases in New Guinea, and they were doing it by ship convoy. Large convoys of transport vessels protected by destroyers and covered by land-based fighters would sail from Rabaul on New Britain Island across the Bismarck Sea to ports on New Guinea's northern coast. The Allied solution seemed equally straightforward. Use Army Air Force's bombers to sink the convoys before they could unload, but in practice, this proved nearly impossible. The 5th Air Force had B-17 Flying Fortresses and various twin-engine bombers available for anti-shipping strikes. Standard doctrine called for horizontal bombing from altitudes between 10,000 and 12,000 feet. Bombardiers would line up their targets through their Norden bomb sites, calculate the lead angle needed to account for the ship's movement, and release their bombs. In practice, it almost never worked. Ships could change speed and direction with relative ease. By the time bombs fell from 10,000 feet, a descent that took many seconds, the ship had often moved out of the impact zone. Even large, slow transports could take evasive action if they spotted the bombers early enough. The Norden bomb sight, so effective against stationary land targets, struggled with the moving targets presented by ships at sea. There were other problems too. At 10,000 to 12,000 feet, bombers were well within range of Japanese anti-aircraft fire. The escorts, destroyers armed with rapid-fire anti-aircraft guns, could throw up walls of flak that damaged bombers and disrupted bombing runs. Japanese Zero fighters would climb up to intercept the bomber formations, forcing them to break formation or abort their runs. The results spoke for themselves. In the first months of 1942, Japanese convoys were getting through with minimal losses. The Allies were dropping thousands of pounds of bombs, losing aircraft and crews, and achieving very little. The Japanese were successfully reinforcing their New Guinea garrisons. If this continued, Port Moresby would fall, and with it, Australia's defensive perimeter. General George Brett, for all his other qualities, seemed unable to solve this problem. He stuck to doctrine, insisting on horizontal bombing from altitude despite mounting evidence that it wasn't working. Pilot morale plummeted. The Japanese, meanwhile, grew increasingly confident, running convoys with lighter escorts because they knew the Allied air threat was minimal. Into this situation, in late July 1942, stepped a new commander who would change everything. Major General George Churchill Kenny took command of Allied Air Force's Southwest Pacific area on July 28, 1942, after General Douglas MacArthur had essentially fired Brett for ineffectiveness. Kenny's first meeting with MacArthur was memorable. The general spent an hour detailing everything wrong with the air forces under his command. Kenny listened politely, then asked MacArthur for one thing: the authority to fire anyone who wasn't getting the job done and replace them with people who would. MacArthur agreed, and Kenny went to work with ruthless efficiency. Within weeks, he'd reshuffled the command structure, promoting aggressive leaders like Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead to key positions and sending ineffective officers home. But reorganization alone wouldn't solve the fundamental problem: how to actually sink Japanese ships. Kenny was an innovator by nature. He'd spent time in the engineering division at McCook Field in Ohio, where he'd developed a deep understanding of aerodynamics and aircraft design. Unlike many commanders who'd risen through the ranks as pilots, Kenny understood the technical side of aviation. He knew what aircraft could and couldn't do, and more importantly, he understood that sometimes the solution wasn't to fly better, it was to modify the aircraft themselves. Kenny had been thinking about the anti-shipping problem since before he arrived in the theater. He knew that horizontal bombing from altitude wasn't working. What he needed was a way to attack ships at very low altitude, where accuracy would be much better and where surprise might be achieved. The RAF and Royal Australian Air Force had developed skip bombing, approaching a ship at mast-top height and releasing bombs with delayed fuses so they'd skip across the water and slam into the ship's hull below the waterline. The problem with low-level attacks was that they exposed bombers to intense anti-aircraft fire. Ships bristled with light automatic weapons that could shred a bomber flying straight and level at 200 feet. Pilots attempting such attacks needed some way to suppress that defensive fire before making their bombing runs. In August 1942, shortly after taking command, Kenny flew up to Charters Towers in Queensland to inspect the 3rd Bombardment Group. In a maintenance hangar, Kenny saw something that stopped him in his tracks. A group of mechanics led by a stocky, middle-aged captain were working on an A-20, and the modifications they were making were unlike anything Kenny had seen. They'd removed the transparent bombardier's nose and were installing a solid metal nose packed with 4.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, all aimed straight ahead. The man supervising the work was Paul Pappy Gunn, and Kenny was about to meet the engineer who would help him revolutionize air combat in the Pacific. Gunn had arrived at the 3rd Bombardment Group through a combination of circumstances, connections, and sheer determination. After learning his family was imprisoned, he'd thrown himself into the war effort with manic energy. He'd assembled crated P-40 Kitty Hawk fighters shipped from the United States, leading teams of American and Australian mechanics in getting the fighters combat-ready in record time. He'd made multiple unauthorized flights back to the Philippines, evacuating fighter pilots and mechanics from Del Monte Airfield on Mindanao, often flying through Japanese-controlled airspace in his civilian Beechcraft. On one of these flights, Japanese floatplanes had attacked him over Moro Gulf. The Beechcraft was shot to pieces and crashed into a coconut plantation, but Gunn and his co-pilot survived, rescued by locals who remembered him from his Philippine Airlines days. By the time Kenny arrived, Gunn had become known throughout the 5th Air Force as a man who could fix anything, scavenge anything, and who had absolutely no fear of authority if it got in the way of winning the war. The story that got him banned from Brisbane for several months was typical. Gunn needed aircraft parts desperately, but a supply officer was dragging his feet on paperwork. According to legend, he drew his service pistol and explained to the supply officer that the parts could be requisitioned by paperwork or by other means. The parts were immediately forthcoming. Gunn's work on the A-20 had started from a simple observation. The A-20 Havoc was a fine aircraft, fast and maneuverable, but its armament for ground attack was pitiful. The standard configuration included a few .30 caliber machine guns in a flexible mount in the bombardier's nose, fired by the bombardier through transparent glass. These were fine for defensive purposes, but useless for offensive strafing. What Gunn envisioned was turning the A-20 into an attack aircraft that could suppress defensive fire on ships before dropping its bombs. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Remove the bombardier and his transparent nose, replace it with a solid metal nose, and pack it full of the heaviest machine guns available, the .50 caliber M2 Browning. But where would he get the guns? The answer came from a grim source: the wrecks of crashed American fighters. In early 1942, as inexperienced pilots ferried P-39 Airacobras and P-40 Warhawks from the United States to Australia, accidents were common. Pilots unfamiliar with the powerful Allison engines would crash on takeoff or landing, destroying the airframes but often leaving the weapons intact. Gunn organized teams to salvage machine guns from these wrecks, collecting a stockpile of .50 caliber weapons. Working with the 3rd Bombardment Group's mechanics at Amberley Field near Brisbane, Gunn designed and built the first A-20 Strafer. The installation was crude by factory standards: metal tubing for the gun mounts, hydraulic lines cobbled together from spare parts, ammunition feeds jury-rigged from whatever materials were at hand. But it worked. 4 .50 caliber guns firing forward delivered devastating firepower. Each M2 Browning had a cyclic rate of around 750 to 850 rounds per minute. 4 guns firing together could put out over 3,000 rounds per minute, 50 heavy slugs per second. Each .50 caliber projectile weighed about half an ounce and traveled at 2,900 feet per second. At the ranges involved in low-level strafing, typically 300 to 500 yards, these rounds could penetrate ship deck armor, shred anti-aircraft gun crews, start fires, and generally create chaos on target vessels. When Kenny saw what Gunn had accomplished, he immediately grasped the implications. Here was the solution to the anti-shipping problem: aircraft that could suppress defensive fire while making low-level bombing runs. He immediately assigned Gunn to his staff as Special Projects Officer and ordered him to convert more A-20 to the Strafer configuration. By September 1942, 16 modified A-2s were operational with the 89th Bomb Squadron of the 3rd Bombardment Group. On September 12th, they were thrown into combat in a coordinated raid against the Japanese airfield at Buna on New Guinea's northern coast. The results exceeded all expectations. The Strafers came in at treetop height, their concentrated fire suppressing Japanese anti-aircraft defenses while they dropped their bombs with devastating accuracy. The mission was a complete success with minimal losses. Kenny and Gunn had proven the concept, but Gunn was already thinking bigger. The A-20 was a good aircraft, but it had limitations. Primarily range. What if they could apply the same modifications to a larger, longer-ranged aircraft? What if they could turn the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber into an even more potent strafer? The North American B-25 Mitchell was in many ways the perfect candidate for conversion to a strafer. It was larger and heavier than the A-20 with substantially greater range, critical in the vast expanses of the Southwest Pacific. It had a roomy nose section that could accommodate even more forward-firing guns than the A-20, and by late 1942, B-25s were becoming available in quantity. There was another advantage. Sitting in Australia were several B-25 Mitchell bombers that had been ordered by the Royal Netherlands East Indies Air Force before Java fell to the Japanese. These aircraft were now orphans. In March 1942, Gunn and Big Jim Davies did what they did best. They appropriated the aircraft for American use. By November and December 1942, Gunn had moved his operation to more organized facilities at Eagle Farm Airfield in Brisbane and later at facilities in Townsville, Queensland. The first B-25 Strafer was B-25C, serial number 41-12946, nicknamed Margaret. She arrived at Charters Towers on December 8, 1942, assigned to the 91st Bomb Squadron of the 3rd Bomb Group. She was about to become the template for a weapon that would terrorize Japanese shipping for the rest of the war. The conversion process that Gunn and his teams developed was methodical. First, they removed the entire transparent nose section, the bombardier's station with its plexiglass panels and bomb sight. In its place, they installed a solid metal nose, fabricated from aluminum sheet and carefully shaped to maintain the aircraft's aerodynamics. The welds were visible, the rivets numerous, but it was solid and airtight. Inside this new nose, Gunn installed not 4, but 8.50 caliber machine guns. 4 were mounted in the nose itself, positioned through the original bomb aiming panel. 4 more were added in pairs on either side of the lower fuselage, in gun packages mounted to fire forward. All 8 guns were fixed, aimed straight ahead, and triggered by the pilot. The ammunition feed system was a masterpiece of improvisation. Each gun had its own ammunition box, holding 350 to 400 rounds. The boxes were positioned to allow gravity and electric boost motors to feed the belts reliably, even during violent maneuvers. The guns themselves were electrically heated to prevent freezing at altitude, and each had its own charging mechanism. The convergence point, where all 8 streams of fire would intersect, could be adjusted but was typically set at 300 to 400 yards. When all 8 guns fired together, the result was spectacular. The combined rate of fire approached 6,000 to 7,000 rounds per minute, over 100 heavy slugs per second converging on the target. A 2-second burst would put 200 to 250 half-inch projectiles into a target area roughly the size of a small ship's bridge. Nothing could withstand that kind of concentrated firepower. Anti-aircraft gun crews were wiped out before they could effectively return fire. Light structures were shredded. Even armored components could be penetrated by sustained fire. But Gunn didn't stop with the forward-firing armament. The B-25C strafers retained their defensive guns, the top turret with twin .50s, waist guns, and eventually tail guns. This meant that even while attacking, the aircraft could defend themselves against Japanese fighters. And of course, the B-25 still had a bomb bay, capable of carrying up to 3,000 pounds of bombs. The combination was devastating. Approach a target at low level, suppress all defensive fire with overwhelming forward firepower, drop bombs with near-perfect accuracy from mast-top height, and then strafe again while aggressing. It was a completely different way of using medium bombers. By early February 1943, the entire 91st Bomb Squadron had been converted to strafer B-25s. Gunn's workshops were running flat out, with work continuing 24 hours a day. By September 1943, approximately 150 B-25s had been modified to the Strafer configuration in theater. Word of these modifications was filtering back to the United States. But before the factory could begin incorporating Gunn's changes, the Strafer B-25s would have to prove themselves in the ultimate test, actual combat against a major Japanese convoy. While Gunn was revolutionizing offensive armament, other innovative minds in the 5th Air Force were solving the problem of how to actually hit ships with bombs from low altitude. The solution came from Major William "Bill" Benn with B-17 Flying Fortresses. Ben had been frustrated by the same problems everyone else faced: High-altitude horizontal bombing didn't work against ships. But Ben liked to experiment. What if, instead of dropping bombs from high altitude, you flew extremely low, 50 to 200 feet above the water, and released bombs with delayed fuses? The bombs would skip across the water's surface like flat stones, bouncing toward the target ship before detonating either on impact with the hull or underwater next to it. In late 1942, Ben conducted the first operational tests of skip bombing using B-17s. The results were promising enough that Kenny ordered intensive training. The problem was finding a suitable target to practice on. The solution came in the form of the SS Pruth, a 4,700-ton steamer that had run aground on Natiara Reef near Port Moresby during a storm in January 1924. The wreck was still there, a perfect stationary target. Starting in late February 1943, squadrons from the 3rd Bomb Group, including both A-20 strafers and the new B-25 strafers, began intensive practice sessions against the Pruth wreck. The technique they developed was precise. Approach the target at 200 to 250 feet altitude, flying straight and level. At a calculated distance from the target, usually 300 to 400 yards, release a bomb with a 4 to 5 second delay fuse. The bomb would strike the water, skip once or twice, and then either hit the ship's hull or explode underwater close alongside. The training wasn't without cost. 2 aircraft were damaged by flying debris from bomb blasts. A 3rd aircraft actually collided with the wreck's mast during a low pass, crashing with the loss of its crew. But the survivors learned from these mistakes, and by the end of February 1943, pilots had become proficient in the technique. They also developed a variation called mast height bombing, involving flying even lower, sometimes at 50 to 100 feet, and approaching along the length of the target ship. Some pilots combined the techniques, sometimes achieving 4 hits with 4 bombs. Most crews eventually preferred mast height bombing. It was easier to execute, and the results were almost identical. But low-level bombing had one critical vulnerability. While the aircraft flew straight and level on their bombing run, they were sitting ducks for anti-aircraft fire. A Japanese destroyer's main guns might not be able to track an aircraft at high altitude, but they were perfectly capable of engaging low-flying bombers flying predictable straight-line approaches. This is where Gunn's strafer modifications prove their true value. The tactic that emerged combined skip bombing with strafing in a devastating 1-2 punch. Strafer aircraft would lead the attack, coming in ahead of the bombers and suppressing defensive anti-aircraft fire with their concentrated machine gun fire. With the ship's decks cleared of gun crews and their light weapons silenced, the following bombers could make their low-level attack runs with minimal interference. The heavy .50 caliber rounds from the strafers didn't just kill gun crews, they penetrated deck armor, wrecked gun mounts, started fires, and generally created chaos. Japanese destroyer crews discovered that their ships were horribly vulnerable to this kind of assault. The tactics were revolutionary, but they remained theoretical until tested in actual combat. That test came in March 1943. In late February 1943, Japanese commanders faced a critical decision. Allied forces were advancing in New Guinea, threatening Japanese positions at Lae and Salamaua. These bases needed troops and supplies. The solution was obvious: send a large convoy from Rabaul on New Britain Island across the Bismarck Sea to Lae. The convoy that departed Rabaul on February 28, 1943, was substantial. 8 transport ships carrying approximately 6,900 troops from the 51st Division, plus ammunition, food, and supplies. Escorting them were 8 destroyers under the command of Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura. Additionally, the convoy would have air cover from about 100 Japanese fighter aircraft. What Japanese planners didn't know was that Allied intelligence had broken their codes. The Allies knew the convoy was coming, knew roughly when it would arrive, and had time to plan a coordinated response. General Kenny was about to field test all his innovations at once. The Allied forces assembled for the attack were substantial: 154 fighters, 34 light bombers, 41 medium bombers, including the new Strafer B-25s, and 39 heavy bombers. Kenny's plan was methodical. High-level B-17s would attack first, forcing ships to break formation. Then, while the convoy was scattered and disorganized, the low-level strafers and skip bombers would come in for the kill. On March 1st, reconnaissance aircraft spotted the convoy north of New Britain, but bad weather prevented any attacks. The same weather helped the Japanese, but on the morning of March 2nd, the weather cleared and B-17 found the convoy again. The first attacks began that afternoon. One large merchant vessel was sunk, 2 damaged, and a destroyer was set on fire. The Japanese convoy pressed on. On the morning of March 3rd, 1943, the weather was clear and bright. The Japanese convoy rounded Huon Peninsula and was heading into Huon Gulf, approaching Leh. They were so close, just hours from unloading. But Allied aircraft were already airborne from Port Moresby, assembling over Cape Ward Hunt for a coordinated mass attack. The attack plan was elegant. First, 13 B-17s would bomb from medium altitude, forcing the convoy to disperse. Next, 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters would come in at low level, strafing to suppress defenses. Following them would be the American Strafer B-25s from the 90 Bomb Squadron. Behind them would come more bombers employing skip bombing techniques. By 10 a.m., the battle had started. The B-17s went in first, their bombs scattering the convoy. Then came the Beaufighters, their 4 20mm cannons raking the decks. Japanese Zero fighters tried to intercept, but American P-38 Lightning fighters were flying top cover. Then came the moment Pappy Gunn had been working toward for months. 12 B-25 strafers from the 90th Bomb Squadron roared in at wave-top height. They came in line abreast, approaching the convoy at over 200 miles per hour. At 400 yards, the pilots opened fire. The effect was apocalyptic. 8 guns per aircraft, 12 aircraft attacking simultaneously, 96 heavy machine guns firing together, nearly 10,000 rounds per minute converging on the Japanese ships. The forward transports simply disappeared in a storm of tracer fire and explosive impacts. Gun crews were annihilated. Bridge structures were shredded. Fires erupted across multiple ships. At 300 yards, flying through their own tracer fire, the B-25 pilots released their bombs with delayed fuses. The weapons skipped across the water before slamming into hulls below the waterline or detonating alongside the ships. Then the strafers were passed, still firing, raking the ships from stern to stem as they aggressed. Behind them came more bombers, A-20s and conventional B-25s, making their own skip-bombing runs against targets that were already burning and listing. The Japanese fought back desperately, but with their gun crews dead and their light weapons destroyed, their fire was ineffective. The slaughter continued for the next 2 days. On March 4th, Allied aircraft returned to finish off crippled ships and strafe survivors in lifeboats, a controversial tactic even at the time. PT boats joined the hunt, torpedoing damaged vessels. When the smoke cleared, the results were staggering. All 8 transports were sunk. 4 of the 8 destroyers were also sent to the bottom. Of the 6,900 Japanese troops who had sailed from Rabaul, only about 1,200 made it to shore. Another 2,700 were rescued by submarines and the surviving destroyers and returned to Rabaul. The rest, approximately 2,890 men, were dead. Allied losses were minimal: 13 aircrew killed in action, 3 more in accidents, 5 aircraft lost in combat, 1 B-17, 3 P-38s, and 2 more lost to accidents. It was one of the most lopsided victories in the history of aerial warfare. General Douglas MacArthur called it one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time. Japanese Captain Tamichi Hara, who commanded one of the surviving destroyers, said simply, "Japan's defeat there was unbelievable. Never was there such a debacle." The Japanese would never again attempt to run a major surface convoy to New Guinea in daylight, and at the heart of this victory were Paul Gunn's Strafer B-25s. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had proven the concept beyond any doubt. Word of the Strafer B-25's success reached the United States quickly. In April 1943, Pappy Gunn received orders to report to North American Aviation's plant in Inglewood, California. His job was to consult with factory engineers and help them understand exactly what he'd done to create the Stryker configuration. The result was the B-25G model, which entered production in mid-1943. The B-25G took Gunn's field modifications and formalized them with proper engineering, but it also added something new: a 75mm M4 cannon mounted in the nose, firing straight ahead. This was the same gun used on M4 Sherman tanks, adapted for aircraft use. The 75mm installation was impressive from an engineering standpoint. The gun was 9.5 feet long and weighed approximately 900 pounds without ammunition. The bombardier's nose had to be shortened by 26 inches to accommodate it. The cannon's breech extended back under the pilot's seat, and a complex cradle system absorbed the 21 inches of recoil. The navigator served as the cannoneer, manually loading the 15-pound shells. A rack next to the gun held 21 rounds protected by armor plate. In theory, the 75mm gun was devastating. In practice, the cannon was less successful than hoped. The gun's slow rate of fire, maybe 4 shots per attack run, was a liability. The manual loading process was cumbersome under combat conditions. The massive recoil threw off the aircraft's navigation compass by as much as 15 degrees. Most crews found that the concentrated firepower of 8.50 caliber machine guns was more useful. Still, 400 B-25G aircraft were produced, along with 63 B-25Cs that were modified to G standard. The follow-on B-25H model, which entered production in August 1943, addressed some of these issues while doubling down on the Stryker concept. 1,000 B-25Hs were built. The B-25H replaced the heavy M4 cannon with a lighter T-13E1 cannon. More importantly, it increased forward-firing firepower significantly. The standard B-25H came from the factory with 4 fixed .50 caliber machine guns in the nose above the 75mm cannon. Additionally, it had 4 more .5s in blister packages on the sides of the forward fuselage, firing straight ahead. Combined with the guns in the nose, this gave the B-25H 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns when the cannon was removed. The defensive armament was also upgraded. The top turret with its twin .5s was moved forward. Twin .50 caliber guns were added to a new tail gunner position. Single .50s were mounted in waist positions on both sides. North American's promotional material proudly proclaimed that the B-25H could bring to bear 10 machine guns coming and 4 going, in addition to the 75mm cannon, 8 rockets, and 3,000 pounds of bombs. In practice, many B-25Hs went even further. Field modifications added more guns to various positions, and some aircraft ended up with 14 to 18 .50 caliber machine guns. When all forward-firing guns let loose simultaneously, they put out 10,000 to 12,000 rounds per minute. Nothing could survive in that cone of fire. Total B-25 production reached 9,816 aircraft during World War II, making it one of the most produced American medium bombers. The innovations that Pappy Gunn had pioneered in crude field workshops in Australia were now being mass-produced by one of America's largest aircraft manufacturers. Throughout 1943 and 1944, Stryker B-25s became the scourge of Japanese shipping, ground installations, and airfields across the Southwest Pacific. By war's end, B-25 units in the Pacific had destroyed approximately 697 Japanese aircraft in air-to-air combat, 150 more on the ground, and over 1,500 vehicles. They'd sunk or damaged hundreds of ships. Pappy Gunn participated in many of these missions personally. Despite being in his mid-40s, he flew combat missions throughout 1943 and into 1944, but he carried a personal burden. His family remained imprisoned at Santo Tomas, and news from the camp was sporadic. This knowledge drove him to even greater extremes of dedication. Every mission brought the war closer to its end and closer to freeing his family. In late 1944, as American forces returned to the Philippines, Gunn was there, flying missions in support of the landings. But during a low-level Japanese air raid on Leyte, he was caught in the open. Phosphorus fragments from a Japanese incendiary bomb entered his upper left arm, burning deep into the tissue. The wound was serious enough to require immediate evacuation and remove Gunn from combat operations. He spent months in hospitals in Australia receiving treatment for a wound that would cause him pain for the rest of his life. But while Gunn lay in a hospital bed, events were moving rapidly in the Philippines. American forces were advancing on Manila, and General Douglas MacArthur, who knew Gunn's story and admired his contributions, personally ordered a special operation. On February 3, 1945, a flying wedge of troops from the 1st Cavalry Division was sent to liberate Santo Tomas internment camp. They were accompanied by Colonel Dave Hutchinson, who had specific orders: find the Gunn family and ensure their safety. When American troops burst through the gates of Santo Tomas, they found over 3,700 Allied prisoners, many near starvation. Among them were Polly Gunn and her 4 children, all alive but severely malnourished. Days after the liberation, on February 7th, MacArthur himself visited Santo Tomas. According to some accounts, he met with the Gunn family and then arranged for them to be flown to Australia on military aircraft. They landed in Australia to be reunited with Pappy after 3 years of separation. The reunion was bittersweet. The family was together again, but all had been changed by their ordeals. The children had spent their formative teenage years in a prison camp. Polly had held the family together through sheer determination, and Gunn himself, wounded and in constant pain, had to confront the fact that his family had suffered while he'd been unable to protect them. But they were alive, and they were together. Gunn received numerous decorations for his wartime service: 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, the Silver Star, Legion of Merit, the Air Medal, and 9 Purple Hearts. He officially retired from the Army Air Forces on June 30, 1948, as a full colonel, medically retired due to the disabilities from his combat wounds. In the post-war years, Gunn returned to aviation. He rebuilt Philippine Airlines, the airline he'd helped create before the war. The company expanded under his leadership, establishing routes across the South Pacific. PAL still operates today, and the company recognizes Gunn as one of its founders, but flying was in Gunn's blood. On October 11, 1957, Gunn was piloting a Beechcraft 18 on a charter flight over the Philippines. A tropical thunderstorm moved into his path, and the aircraft crashed. Paul "Pappy" Gunn died in the wreckage at age 57, doing what he'd done for most of his life: flying. His remains were returned to the United States and interred at Barrancas National Cemetery at Naval Air Station, Pensacola, Florida, the place where his aviation career had begun 4 decades earlier.